So today we'll be talking about Chapter 32, Section 3. And the title of this is The Ford and Carter Years. Now, the Ford and Carter administrations are the two presidents that came after Richard Nixon. Of course, Friday we learned about Watergate, and we learned about Nixon's corruption and his felony attempt to defraud the 1972 election, how he was caught, and how he was forced to resign. And so now we're going to deal with the aftermath of that and learning about what came next. So both these administrations attempted to remedy the nation's worst economic crisis in decades, and that leads us to the clip.
What by many is the most important speech of President Carter's term. A look back now as 830 WCCO's year-end special continues.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. We've always believed in something called progress. We've always had a faith that the days of our children would be better than our own. Our people are losing that faith. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years. We were taught that our armies were always invincible and our causes were always just, only to suffer the agony of Vietnam. We respected the presidency as a place of honor until the shock of Watergate. We've got to stop crying and start sweating. Stop talking and start walking. Working together with our common faith, we cannot fail.
Now, before we get to Jimmy Carter, we need to learn about President Gerald Ford. September of 1974, following Nixon's resignation, new President Gerald Ford was sworn in, and on one of his first acts as president, he used his special privilege of presidential pardon to drop all charges on Richard Nixon. He claimed he was doing this to move the country past the Watergate scandal so that this would not continue and that we could move forward. However, this guy just pardoned Richard Nixon. Let's be real. Most people aren't going to trust him or take him seriously for the rest of his term as president. So, he was president for a short time, even though he was never elected by the American people. So, what is he going to do? Well, first off, this issue of stagflation that we've been learning about. The crisis of high inflation coupled with high unemployment. And one of the big causes of this was rising oil prices. Well, one of the reasons for the rising oil prices was the rise of international demand for oil. how do you curb rising international demand for oil? Well, I mean, there's a few methods, but Ford's was the least successful. He went on television and said, "American people, I need you to drive your cars less often. Can you do that for me?" And obviously that's not going to have a great deal of effect. Now, like any other conservative, he's going to attempt to cut government spending. He's going to try to raise the interest rates to restrict credit and reduce the level of debt that Americans were bringing upon themselves. And these, quote, tight money policies actually triggered a recession in the United States. Not to mention that Congress was controlled by the Democratic Party at this time, and generally when one party controls the legislature and another party controls the executive, that means that not a lot is going to get done. And so the Democratic Party continued to battle Ford on every step of his economic programs. Perhaps one of Ford's only successes was in the realm of foreign policy. Remember Nixon's historic visit to China and the Soviet Union, and his opening up of relations and trade with these two superpowers. Ford was able to continue these relationships and, in fact, fostered the signing of the Helsinki Accords, a mutual cooperation treaty between Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and democratically controlled Western Europe. And this was generally heralded as a great success. Yet during Ford's presidency, peace talks in Vietnam failed. President Ford asked Congress for aid to South Vietnam. He even suggested sending weapons or soldiers back to South Vietnam. And democratically controlled Congress was not going to allow this at all. We are not going to perpetuate the war in Vietnam. And so without American support, South Vietnam surrendered to Communist North Vietnam in 1975. Meanwhile, U.S. merchant ship Mayaguez was seized off the coast of Cambodia by pirates. President Ford ordered the U.S. Army to retake the ship. And in the attempted bungled rescue of the Mayaguez, 41 American soldiers and civilians lost their lives to rescue 39 individuals. That is not a successful rescue operation and led to a great deal of criticism from President Ford.
At first, public opinion polls put Mr. Ford's popularity higher than any American leader since Franklin Roosevelt. But the ratings took a new plunge when the new president announced a full pardon for Richard Nixon. In the following months, President Ford moved out into the world. In November, he became the first American president in office to visit Japan. From Japan, he went to his first summit meeting with Russian leaders at Vladivostok and signed an agreement with Mr. Brezhnev limiting offensive nuclear weapons for the next 10 years. This deal helped strengthen a détente increasingly under strain, especially in the Middle East.
And so, as you can imagine, with the embarrassment of the pardoning of Nixon and the failure of the Mayaguez and the troubling economy with the recession triggered by Ford's tight money policy, Jimmy Carter's campaign for presidency is going to be a shoo-in. He promised to restore integrity to the presidency. He's arguably one of our most honest presidents. And despite his reputation for transparency and his career of integrity, he actually defeated Ford by a very narrow margin. It's rare that anyone defeats an incumbent president, good or bad. Now, meanwhile, Jimmy Carter's personality is very down to earth. He's from North Georgia, not too far from us. He was an avid outdoorsman, has quite the southern accent, and held regular fireside chats following the tradition of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on both radio as well as television. Now, his reputation for integrity has left his legacy as an honorable man. However, politics is not always about integrity, unfortunately. Sometimes it's about having to be willing to do some backhanded, dirty things. And because of this, he often refused to make deals with Congress. He often relied on his advisors, who were also from Georgia. And because of his unwillingness to compromise on his integrity and his ideals, sadly, Congress turned against him. Both parties in Congress joined to derail many of Carter's budget reforms, many of his major political reforms that he hoped to achieve. Sadly, this honest, decent man was derailed by much of the corruption in the system that he was trying to fix. Yet, despite these hurdles, Carter did have many great successes. For one, contrary to Ford's request for Americans to stop using so much oil, Carter was able to achieve the National Energy Act. This encouraged conservation. That is the careful allocation and use of America's energy sources. The hope and the goal of the National Energy Act was to, by promoting conservation, cut our dependence on foreign oil. And it's taken a lifetime to achieve, but we are finally reaching that point. So this would be heralded as a great success. Now, Jimmy Carter is still alive. In fact, he's in his 90s. And recently he was undergoing cancer treatments. And this very aged, sweet old man, who upon retiring from the presidency became a goodwill ambassador traveling the world to help other people. When asked if he had any regrets about his time as president, he said, "I wish I had sent one more helicopter to Iran." And we'll get to that in just a moment. But violence in the Middle East, which at this time was the world's chief supplier of oil, caused OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, to raise prices on oil. So Carter tried several methods to reduce our dependence on oil, to lower the cost of oil, and unfortunately none were working. And that was when he gave the speech that you heard at the beginning of the lesson, the quote Malay speech, where he said that sadly, for the first time in our history, the majority of Americans believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the previous 5. And I love the part where he says it's time for us to stop crying and to start sweating. To stop trying and to start walking. It's an inspirational speech, but unfortunately speeches don't have a great deal of effect on the economy. And by 1980, due to inflation, the standard of living was dropping. And People were losing confidence in the economy. Now, from 1950 forward, and this is certainly true in the present day, our economy is in a time of transition. The types of jobs that young people are going into are changing for a couple of different obvious reasons. Number one, more so today than even in 1950, automation. Many jobs that were previously done by human beings can now be done by machines. Machines are much cheaper, they're more reliable, and they don't complain. They don't ask for sick days. They don't need time off. They can work around the clock. Another reason that manufacturing jobs have been disappearing since 1950 is foreign competition. The globalization of our economy has allowed us to buy items from around the world, has opened up the free market for global competition. And this has resulted in cheaper products for us, and this has resulted in a greater availability of consumer goods, but this also means that more jobs are being shipped overseas. And so, what types of jobs are left in the United States, since most things that we buy are made elsewhere? Well, this means that the service sector of our economy is going to expand. That means there are more jobs available today in low-paying service-related industries, such as waiting tables, cooking, tending bar. However, there are still many higher-paying service sector jobs. Teaching is part of the service sector. It doesn't pay great, but it does require an education. It does require a certain degree of skill. Practicing law or medicine or in sales. These are all services as well. And once again, these do require a greater degree of education and skills. Unfortunately, gone are the days where the world needs ditch diggers, because we just don't. The world does still need lower level service workers, but those jobs do not pay well enough at this time to provide a living wage. And so the education of our citizens is necessary. Jimmy Carter will certainly go down in history as one of the most compassionate civil rights activists. In fact, he hired more African Americans and women than any other previous president. Very few civil rights laws were passed during his time. Some civil rights groups mourned the fact that the famous Back versus the University Regions of California struck down affirmative action quotas, calling them reverse discrimination. Yet, affirmative action does still allow for race to be a factor in determining university admissions. Yet quotas, that is, quotas requiring certain numbers of people from certain ethnic groups, are no longer in use due to the Back decision. Of all of Carter's goals as president, I believe that his main goal was advocating the advancement of human rights or basic freedoms for all people. Human rights are those inalienable rights that we believe that no government has the right to take away, namely the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we believe these transition borders, and these are more important than state sovereign rights. And so Carter chose to cut off aid to some, if not all. There were exceptions, unfortunately. There are still some things that have to be done behind closed doors, but he did cut off aid to many of our own allies that chose to mistreat their own citizens. The country of Panama was created in 1900 to facilitate the construction of the Panama Canal. Panama was formerly a part of the country of Colombia. And we facilitated Panama's independence from Colombia so that they would assist us in building the canal. Yet we retained control over the canal itself. And so Carter helped to resolve this dispute. Panamanians resented having their country split in two because of this canal controlled by the United States. And so a treaty was signed giving control of the canal over to Panama at the beginning of the new millennium. And today, Panama controls the canal. And this has led to improved relations between the U.S. and Latin America.
Mr. Sakharov, you said that the United States would use its good offices to seek the release of prisoners of conscience. And you said that you wanted to continue to shape a world responsible to human aspirations. As you know, there are human rights problems in many other countries. And some of them, like Iran or the Philippines, we support with arms or we support with American aid. These are countries where many people believe we have more leverage than we might have in the Soviet Union. What, if anything, do you plan to try to do to help victims of political repression in these countries?
I think without my trying to take credit for it, there has been a substantial move toward concern about human rights throughout the world. I think this has taken place in probably a dozen or more different countries. There's an arousing interest in the position that our own government here in our free country does take. Obviously, there are deprivations of human rights even more brutal than the ones on which we've commented up to now. In Uganda, the actions there have disgusted the entire civilized world. And as you know, we have no diplomatic relationships with Uganda. But here is an instance where both Ambassador Andrew Young and I have expressed great concern about what is there. The British are now considering asking the United Nations to go into Uganda to assess the horrible murders that apparently are taking place in that country, the persecution of those who have aroused the ire of Mr. Amin. I've expressed my concern about imprisoned political prisoners in South Korea, in Cuba, in many countries, in several countries rather, in South America, and I'll continue to do so. I have never had an inclination to single out the Soviet Union as the only place where human rights are being abridged. We have, I think, a responsibility and a legal right to express our disapproval of violations of human rights. The Helsinki Agreement, so-called Basket 3 provision, ensures that some of these human rights should be preserved. We are a signatory of the Helsinki Agreement. We are ourselves culpable in some ways for not giving people adequate right to move around our country, for restricting unnecessarily, in my opinion, visitation to this country by those who disagree with us politically. So I think that we all ought to take a position in our own country and among our friends and allies, among our potential adversaries, that human rights is something on which we should bear a major responsibility for leadership. And I have made it clear to the Soviet Union and to others in the Eastern European community that I'm not trying to launch a unilateral criticism of them, that I'm trying to set a standard in our own country and make my concerns expressed throughout the world, not single out against any particular country.
Now, what you just heard was President Carter defending his insistence on a moral diplomacy. That is, that we were not going to send foreign aid to countries that abused their own citizens. And that included the Soviet Union. And there you heard a press conference where he was responding to questions about why he was doing this. Because he strained relations with the Soviet Union by refusing to provide promised aid because of human rights abuses that the USSR was inflicting on its own people. Because of this, the strategic arm limitations talks were delayed, though Carter and Brezhnev did finally sign these in June of 1979. In December of the same year, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. As a result of this, the SALT talks were dismissed. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, occupying the country for quite some time. This was seen as an expansion of the Cold War, yet Afghanistan would prove to be the Soviets' Vietnam, and the United States would work with the rebels to resist the Soviet occupation. Perhaps one of Jimmy Carter's greatest successes was the Camp David Accords, where the president hosted talks between the leader of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Benin. And these Camp David Accords forged a peace between Israel and the Middle East. The conditions of this peace were that Israel would withdraw their troops from the Sinai Peninsula, giving Egypt control over the Suez Canal. And in return, Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist, meaning they would formally stop trying to retake Israel. There had been 4 wars from 1948 to 1978. 4 times Egypt tried to unite the Middle East and destroy Israel. And finally, Jimmy Carter was able to get both sides to sit down and resolve their differences peacefully. And that is a major diplomatic success. Yet in the realm of foreign policy, the Iranian hostage crisis would prove to be Carter's undoing. The cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini led a popular uprising against the Shah of Iran. The Shah had been a U.S.-sponsored dictator of Iran for more than 20 years. He was undemocratic, he refused to allow elections, he quelled dissent, he was all kinds of nasty. And he had the support of the United States because he was resisting the urge of communism in the country of Iran. In fact, when Khomeini established an Islamic State in Iran, we allowed the Shah to come to the United States for cancer treatments. And so when we look at the Middle East, we zoom in. This is modern-day Israel. This is the West Bank. Perhaps you've heard about this on the news. This area is in dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. And then you have the Golan Heights. So these 2 territories were taken by Israel during these 4 wars in which Egypt tried to take Israel. The Camp David Accords were resolving the dispute around the Sinai Peninsula, which is here. Israel was occupying this, and then in 1978, they agreed to withdraw their troops in return for Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula.
February the 1st, 1979. Not only an historic day in the history of Iran, but also one that was to have profound effects on world politics for years to come. On that day, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to his homeland after 14 years in exile. The Shah of Iran had fled the country just a fortnight earlier. His leftover government was now denounced as illegal by the Ayatollah's supporters, who wanted their religious leader to take over the reins and turn the country into an Islamic state. Simon Dring was the BBC reporter at the airport when Khomeini arrived to his tumultuous welcome.
Inside the terminal, the chaos became almost uncontrollable. More than 1,000 church leaders had gathered to meet him, not that they saw very much. As everybody fought to get close, the man himself stood calmly in the shadows, waiting for the songs of welcome and the prayers to finish, before taking his turn to speak. His first words were, as expected, forceful and to the point. This is the first step in the final defeat of 50 years of criminal rule. We must cut off the hands of the foreigners who are responsible for our ills and cast out all the roots of the old regime. And with that, he left to face his people.
And those people, in a frenzy of excitement, turned out in their hundreds of thousands to give the Ayatollah's motorcade a rapturous welcome as it progressed through the streets of the capital. Within days of this victorious return, Khomeini announced that democracy had no place in Iran. An Islamic republic was established. Supporters of the Shah were executed, and the Ayatollah himself was made the absolute ruler. The ramifications of this February day rumbled on for years, through the Middle East to Europe, and terrorism, to Washington, and the Irangate scandal, which threatened the American administration itself.
You see, when Ayatollah Khomeini seized power in Iran and supporters of the Shah were being executed, and the Shah realized that his regime was crumbling and needed to flee the country, the United States gave him safe harbor. We allowed him entry into the United States for, quote, cancer treatment, and then refused to give him back. In response to this, Iranian students seized the American embassy in Iran. 52 hostages were taken, and the captors demanded that the Shah be returned to face trial in Iran before the hostages would be returned. President Carter refused, saying that we would not negotiate with terrorists. This resulted in a standoff. Though our insistence on a refusal to negotiate with terrorists remained our public position, privately we were negotiating with the Iranians for the release of these hostages. Finally, the captives were released in January of 81. Part of the condition of their release was that they would be released shortly after Ronald Reagan's inauguration. So partly this was a political move to ensure a Republican victory in the 1980 presidential election. But more importantly, the hostages were finally released And I believe it's the movie Argo you can watch that details their capture and eventual release.
This is an ABC News special. The Iran crisis. America held hostage. Day 58.
No one will easily forget how the 80s began. American hostages in Iran gave birth to a national mania and to a television program that reminded us nightly of our plight. America held hostage. Americans were shocked and angered. How could a third world country headed by a religious fanatic bring a superpower to its knees? Why couldn't we just get them out? We found that it was a very complicated affair, and that terrorism has many faces. On November 4th, 1979, student radicals seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking over 60 Americans hostage. Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran's fundamentalist Muslim leader, refuses to release the Americans. Like most momentous events, the hostage crisis has its roots in history. Our involvement began with this man, the Shah of Iran, when the CIA helped stage a coup d'etat and place Mohammad Reza Pahlavi on the throne. For 37 years, the Shah kept Iran staunchly in the Western political orbit and relentlessly modernized his oil-rich country. Internal dissent was quelled in the streets and in the torture chambers by Savak, the Shah's secret police. Happy to have an anti-communist policeman in the vital oil center of the Persian Gulf, successive U.S. governments overlooked Iran's growing internal dissent.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
But that was changing fast. By late 1978, Iranians were no longer tolerating the Shah's excesses. Demonstrators were shot in the streets. More and more protesters waved pictures of the Shah's most powerful enemy. In France, Khomeini was a virtual government in exile, fueling the religious revolution at home.
Oh, my people, do not hesitate. You have the power. Do not be afraid of these superpowers.
Realizing that he had lost his grip on his country, the Shah and his family fled. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini returned to a tumultuous, emotional welcome. The country was his. In October, against the strong advice of the State Department, President Carter allowed the Shah to enter the country for cancer treatment. That was all the fuel the student radicals in Tehran needed.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States.
While the Iranians burned an American flag in front of the embassy, they said the takeover had the express blessing of the Ayatollah Khomeini. In return for their American hostages' freedom, they're demanding the United States give up the deposed Shah of Iran from his hospital bed in New York.
Aside from wanting the Shah back, the militants demanded the return of his vast wealth, admission that the United States had harmed Iran, and an agreement not to intervene in its internal affairs. The demands were unacceptable to Washington. The hostages were caught in the middle of a dangerous political game. All they could do was wait.